Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're excited that you're taking your seat here as we prepare for leading from any seat with Brad Coffman. We will turn this over to you, Brad.
Thank you, Sharon. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're located in the country this morning. I'm in Central Time, so it's good morning still here. My name's Brad Coffman. I'm joining you from Russellville, Arkansas, and I'm really excited to be spending some time with you today. So we're going to talk about something that I believe very strongly. You don't have to have a title to demonstrate leadership. And that's a core philosophy in the work that I've been doing over the last several years. And maybe more importantly for this group, you don't have to wait until you've been doing this work for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years before you start having something valuable to contribute. So this is the first year advantage leading from any seat. And my hope is that when we're finished, you'll recognize that being new doesn't disqualify you from leadership. In some ways, I think it actually does give you an advantage. But before we get into that, I do want to start with a thank you. First of all, thank you to CoAbe for continuing to invest in people and into the professionals that do this work every day. We want to thank our partners at Essential Ed for sponsoring today's event and helping making opportunities like this possible. I've had the opportunity to work with these organizations, some great people in the organizations over the last several years, and I'm grateful for what they do to support adult education across the country. And then really, I want to thank you for joining today and investing in yourself by being here, investing in your students and investing in your programs. And thank you for choosing the work that changes lives. Those of us that have been around the work know that these changes don't always look the same. Sometimes they're academic, sometimes they're economic, and sometimes they're even generational. And sometimes it's just simply helping somebody believe again that they're capable of doing something that they may have convinced themselves that they couldn't do. And that matters. And the work that you've chosen matters. So before we talk about leadership, let's very quickly just tell you a little bit about who you're spending the next 40 minutes with. So I've spent about 26 years in education. I've had the opportunity to serve in a lot of different seats, in a lot of different roles. I've been a teacher, I've been a program leader, I've been an administrator. I've presented through CoAbe, currently serve as the CoAbe local liaison. And along the way, I wrote a book called Trail Leadership, Quiet Leadership in a Loud World. But probably what's most relevant today is that a lot of what I've learned about leadership didn't come from having a leadership title. It came from watching people and it came from making mistakes. It came from working with students and colleagues, and it came from realizing that some of the most influential people I've ever worked with weren't necessarily the people with the biggest titles. So I want to start with you. Let's use the chat prompts real quick right out of the gate, and I'm going to make this very easy for you. Simply one word, what makes someone a great educator? Don't overthink it. Just put the first word that comes to mind in the chat. Great. And you know what I'm noticing in the words that you're putting there? I'm not seeing anything that relates to title. I'm not seeing anything that relates to position. I'm not seeing anything that relates to the years of experience. What you all are describing in the chat, those are behaviors. And so you're describing how people show up for other people. I want you to remember that because we're going to come back to it. So today's outcomes, I'm going to give you four things today. I'm going to give you a simple framework for everyday leadership that you can apply in the position that you hold. I'm going to give you a formula so that you can think about how you grow your influence. And then we're going to do some practical strategies for overcoming some barriers that can sometimes get in the way of us stepping up. And then we're going to finish with a next step And we're going to have one thing that you can actually try this next week in your programs. So I don't want this to be just 40 minutes of leadership theory. I want you to leave with something that you can use, something that's practical. But before we talk about how to lead from your seat, there's a myth that we need to get rid of. So I think there's a myth that shows up pretty quickly when we're new to something or in a new role. That myth is that I have to know everything before I can lead. Maybe you've already felt some of that. Maybe you're around people that know all of the acronyms, they know all of the systems, they know who to pick up the phone and call. Maybe they know why something's done a certain way. And you may be sitting there thinking, I'm just trying to figure out where everything is. And when you feel that way, I think it's easy to think that we just need to sit back and wait. And we need to wait until we know more. We need to wait until we're more confident. Maybe we need to wait until someone gives us permission. But here's the reality: you don't have to know everything. You do have to care. You do have to learn. And you do have to show up consistently. And actually, being new in a position actually gives you something very valuable. It gives you fresh eyes, it gives you fresh perspective, and you asking questions that of people that have been there maybe 10 years, they may have stopped asking those questions. So you notice things, you're curious, and you haven't learned yet to say, well, that's just the way we've always done it. So don't underestimate the power and the value of being new. So that's going to bring us to the foundational principle behind everything we're going to talk about today. Leadership is not a title. It's simply a mindset that's rooted in influence, initiative, and everyday action. You can have a title and not lead, and you can absolutely have no formal authority and have tremendous influence on the people around you. Because leadership ultimately isn't about what it says underneath your name in your email signature. Leadership is about what happens because you were there. Did somebody feel supported? Did something get better? Did a problem get solved? Did somebody find the courage to keep going? That's leadership. And I could probably prove that many of you are already doing that. Let's take a look at this list. Have you ever helped a coworker without being asked? Have you ever encouraged a student who was struggling? Have you ever solved a problem that was technically not your job? Maybe you've shared a resource with someone else or stepped up when nobody else did. If this sounds like you, will you drop a thumbs click reaction for me? Yeah, look at that. Keep those thumbs coming. And here's what I want you to recognize: those are leadership behaviors. You may not have called them leadership, and nobody may have given you a title for doing them, but every one of those actions either influences another person or makes something better. So maybe the question isn't, am I a leader? Maybe the better question is, how intentionally am I using the influence that I already have? Well, let me tell you why this matters. Our programs need problem solvers. Our programs need advocates, and our programs need relationship builders. And none of those requires a title. Some of the strongest cultures I've ever been a part of were built by people throughout the organization who simply decided, I'm going to make this place better because I'm here. That's leading from every seat every day. And I think the line at the bottom captures it well. Leadership begins the moment you choose to positively influence another person. So let's make our definition of leadership really practical today. We often associate leadership with title and authority, But for today, I want us thinking about influence and impact because a title may give you authority, but it doesn't automatically give you influence. See, influence is something that you build through the way that you show up every day. So let's talk about something that's real practical. Leadership is ownership, leadership is initiative, and leadership is positive influence. Those aren't things that you have to wait 5 years to develop. Those are choices that you can start making right now. And to help us make those choices more intentional, I want to give you just a simple framework. So, the simple framework that I use every day in my leadership is something I call LEAD. It starts with L, and that's to listen actively. Next is E, engage in solutions. A is advocate for others. And D is demonstrate integrity. Those are just four behaviors. And you'll notice that nothing on that list talks about supervising people. There's nothing in there about having a certain title. There's nothing in there about how many years you've been doing this work. All of those are choices that are available to each one of us, regardless of the seat that we're sitting in. So I want to unpack each one, and we're going to start that with one that sounds incredibly simple, but is sometimes much harder to do than we think. The first thing is listen actively. And I think there's an important distinction here. Active listening means listening to understand, not just simply listening long enough to figure out what you're going to say next or listening to respond. That's especially important in adult education because our students don't just bring academic needs through the doors, they bring their lives with them. They've got jobs, they've got kids, they've got transportation issues, they have financial pressures, past experiences with school. Sometimes they have fear, sometimes they have embarrassment, and sometimes things we don't absolutely know anything about. So when a student says, I just can't do this, leadership means getting curious before we start making assumptions. So, what does I can't do this really mean? Is that an academic barrier? Is it transportation? Do they need childcare? Is their work schedule a conflict? Are they lacking confidence? Maybe there's something happening at home. Because sometimes leadership begins by listening long enough to understand what the actual problem is. Because once we understand what the real barrier is, we have a much better chance of helping. But leadership can't stop with just identifying the problem. The next one is E, engage in solutions. I really like this idea. Step towards rather than around. You know, every organization has problems. Every adult education program has problems. Let's face it, pointing out what's wrong is pretty easy. But one of the quickest ways that you can begin establishing yourself as someone who others trust is to become the person who says, here's what I'm seeing, and here's something we might try. You don't have to have the perfect answer. You don't have to solve everything yourself. Leading from any seat certainly doesn't mean stepping outside your role or ignoring procedures. It just simply means complaining isn't your contribution. Bring an idea, ask a question, offer to help. Take one step towards the solution instead of simply standing beside the problem describing it. You know, sometimes the problem you've noticed isn't really yours at all, it's something affecting somebody else. The next one is A, and that's to advocate for others. Sometimes leadership means noticing something that somebody else hasn't noticed yet. And maybe you're the person that's built a relationship with a student. Maybe you're the person that they trust enough to tell what's really happening. And maybe you see a colleague struggling and recognize that they need some support. Advocacy is being willing to say, We need to pay attention to this. Or maybe it's, I think there's more going on here than what we're seeing on the surface. You don't have to be a director to advocate. You don't have to be the counselor. You don't have to be the person with formal authority. Sometimes you're just simply the person who noticed. And then you made the choice not to ignore it. And all of that becomes much more powerful when people know that they can trust you. The next one is D, demonstrate integrity. So we usually define integrity as doing the right thing when nobody's watching. And that's absolutely true. But I think there's another part of integrity that's incredibly important in leadership, and that's consistency. Can people predict which version of you they're going to get? If you say you're going to do something, do you follow through? Do you treat people the same way whether they're in the room or not? And do your actions line up with the things that you say matter? Because over time, people start to calibrate themselves around consistent people. They know if she tells me she's going to take care of it, she'll take care of it. They might say, if he says he's going to follow up, he's going to follow up. If I tell this person something, I can trust what they're going to do with it. See, that's credibility, that's influence. And trust is one of the strongest forms of leadership currency that you can build for yourself. So when we put those four behaviors together, listen, engage, advocate, and demonstrate, those are not four separate leadership tricks. They reinforce each other. So when you listen, you understand people better. When you understand people better, you can engage in better solutions. When you build relationships, you're in a better position to advocate. And when you consistently demonstrate integrity, people begin to trust your influence. That's everyday leadership. And again, you don't have to wait for a title to do any of that. So before we move on, we'll hop to the next slide. I want you to think about the four behaviors: listen, engage, advocate, and demonstrate. And just think to yourself, which one comes most naturally to you? But then maybe the more important question is, which one could you strengthen? Take just a few minutes and think about it. If you'd like to share, you can drop your answer in the chat. What I see oftentimes is people think they listen well, or maybe they demonstrate integrity well. Can you identify an area that you might want to improve or work on? And remember, there's no wrong answer here. Leadership development starts with self-awareness and being able to recognize both your strengths and your weaknesses. Here's what I already bring, and here's where I have room to grow. But I'll ask you, here's another question. How do you actually grow your influence when you don't have any formal authority? And so that's where our next piece comes in. So LEAD gives us a picture of what everyday leaders do. Now I want to shift to how our influence grows. Because if we're talking about leading from any seat, any position, it's really the influence that matters. You may not have positional authority and you may not be able to make the final decision, but you can absolutely build influence. And influence isn't something somebody assigns to you, it's something that you earn. So let's look at three things that help us build. And I think of it as a pretty simple formula. We start with credibility, we add relationships, we add initiative, and that equals leadership. Now, Obviously, leadership is much more complicated than a three-part equation, but I like this simplicity because it gives us something very practical to think about. Do people trust me? Have I built relationships with people? Am I willing to move when there's something I can do? If you consistently build those three things, your influence will grow. And again, none of those require a title. So let's take a look at them one at a time. First, credibility. Credibility is really about whether people trust what they're going to get from you. Do you keep your word? Do you prepare? Do you follow through? And this is one of the areas where I think being new can actually work in your favor. See, you're building your reputation right now. People are learning who you are. They're learning whether you follow through. They're learning whether you come prepared. And they're learning whether you do what you say you're going to do. And you don't build credibility through one big impressive moment. You build it through 100 small moments of consistency. Do you say what you're going to do? And if you can't, do you communicate that? That sounds really simple, but it builds tremendous trust over time. And credibility gets even stronger when it's paired with genuine relationships. So let's take a look at relationships. You know, people don't follow titles, they follow people they trust. And I really believe that last line at the bottom of the slide, leadership without relationship is just authority. And you may be able to make somebody do something because you're in charge, but that's not the same thing as having influence. See, relationships are especially important in adult education. Our students need to know that we see them as people, not simply as test scores, attendance numbers, or completions. And the same thing is true with our coworkers. Learn people's names, ask questions, listen, and notice what's important to them. Maybe check back in on something that they told you last week. Those little things don't feel like some big leadership strategy, but that's how relationships are built. And relationships create the space where influence can happen. Then there's the third piece, and this is where being willing to act becomes important. Let's take a look at initiative. So, initiative is just moving before you're asked. And I want to be careful with that, especially when we're talking to people who may be in their first year. I'm not saying ignore your supervisor. I'm not saying to go change policies. And I'm definitely not saying that you have to fix everything that you notice. But what I am saying is don't let good ideas stay ideas simply because nobody specifically asked you to have one. Maybe initiative is bringing an idea to your director. Maybe it's saying, you know, I've noticed this keeps happening. Could I try something? Maybe it's sharing a resource with your team. Maybe it's something that needs to be done and simply asking, can I help with that? One of the easiest traps to fall into when you're new is the waiting for permission trap. I'm new. I should probably just stay quiet. There's certainly a time to listen and there's certainly a time to learn, but being new doesn't mean that you have nothing to contribute. You learn the system and then be willing to contribute to it. All right, so let's put that formula back to you for just a moment. I want you to think about your current role, not the role that you hope to have someday, not the title that you may eventually earn, but the seat that you're sitting in right now. Where do you already have influence, even without a title? Maybe it's with a student. Maybe it's with another instructor. Maybe it's with your team. Maybe you're the person people come to for a certain kind of help. Maybe you've become the person who brings some energy or maybe some encouragement to the room. Think of one example and just drop that in the chat for me. Where do you already have influence? Lauren says the team. Olivia says in my classroom. Absolutely. Emily, with community partners, that's a powerful one. And here's what I want you to identify. If you can recognize where you already have influence, you can start becoming more intentional about how you use it. So you don't have to have influence over everybody, and you don't have to have a huge platform. Leadership starts with the people already within your reach. I love all the responses. So now all of that sounds really good in theory, but if leading from any seat were always easy, we'd probably do it all the time. But the reality is there's some pretty common things that get in our way. So let's take a look at some of those barriers. So here are four thoughts that can get in the way of leading from where we are. It's not my place. I don't have time. I don't have the authority. But probably the biggest one to me is, what if I mess up? Quick pulse check. If you've ever had one of those thoughts, hit that thumbs up for me. Oh, yeah. I think most of us have had one of these at some time in our career. And these aren't certainly are not bad thoughts. Sometimes they're legitimate concerns. The problem is when they become a reason to never act. So let's take a look at each barrier because I want to give it a practical reframe. Let's start with it's not my place. So there's an important distinction here. Leading from any seat does not mean that every decision is yours to make. Sometimes something really isn't your problem, but that doesn't mean that you don't have any role in making things better. You don't need permission to care. You don't need permission to listen. You don't need permission to improve something within your reach. So instead of asking, is this my place? Maybe ask, what's appropriate for me to contribute from the seat I'm in? Maybe that's an idea. Maybe that's a question. Maybe it's just simply offering to help. That's a very different mindset. And I think that's something that every educator can relate to. Let's take a look at the next one. I don't have time. I tell people all the time, you have the same 24 hours that I have. But there is truth in I don't have time. But I don't want to stand here on this side of the screen and tell educators that you just need to find more time because you don't. That's why I like the idea of micro moment leadership. You know, leadership doesn't necessarily require adding another hour to your day. It can happen in the moments that you're already in. Simply 30 seconds to tell a coworker, you know, you handled that very well. Maybe it's 2 minutes to follow up with a student who had a rough day yesterday. Maybe it's a quick forwarding a resource to somebody because you thought of them. Maybe it's asking, how did that thing go that you told me about last week? Those aren't extra programs. Those are choices inside moments that you already have. And those small moments, they add up, which connects pretty naturally to another barrier, which is the next one. I don't have the authority. That may be true, and maybe you don't. But remember what we've been talking about. Authority and influence are not the same thing. You may not have the authority yet, but you can build credibility, you can build relationships, and you can take appropriate initiative. And you do that through what I call stacked leadership habits. One small action that's repeated consistently, then another, then another, then another. You become the person who follows through. You become the person who notices. You become the person who helps. You become the person who asks a good question. And you become the person who can be counted on. Eventually, those small behaviors stack on top of one another until people start seeing you differently. You don't suddenly announce one day that you're a leader. Your patterns start telling people that for you. And then that's where the barrier that can stop all of us, regardless of our position, regardless of how long we've been doing this, and that's the dreaded, what if I mess up? Well, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. You will. I have, you have, we have all made mistakes. But anybody who has led anything for very long has made a mistake. Leadership doesn't require perfection. And waiting until you know that something will work perfectly usually means that you're going to wait for a very long time. So I come back to this statement: imperfect action beats perfect inaction. I'll say that again: imperfect action beats perfect inaction. Now, that doesn't mean reckless action. It doesn't mean ignoring good judgment. It just means being willing to try, learn, adjust, and try again. Because you see, there's a ripple effect either way. Trying something creates a ripple, but waiting creates one too. Sometimes the student we could have encouraged doesn't get that encouragement. The idea that we could have shared never comes up. The problem that we could have helped solve stays exactly where it was. So choosing not to act is still a choice. And that's where I want to shift our thinking just a little bit from the barriers to something bigger. One of the things that I've come to believe about leadership is that we often don't get to see the full impact of it. You know, leadership is often remembered in moments that the leader has long forgotten. Think about that. Something you say in passing, a conversation you barely remember, a little encouragement that you gave somebody on a difficult day. To you, that might have just been a Tuesday. To them, it may have been something they carried for years. See, that's the ripple effect of leadership. We rarely know how far it travels. And I want you to think about that from the other direction for just a moment as well. Think about someone who's changed your life. You don't have to put this one in the chat. Just think to yourself, maybe it was a teacher, maybe it was a coach, maybe it was a supervisor, maybe it was a colleague, maybe someone in your family. What is it that you remember about them? But here's the question I really want you to consider: do they know? Some of the people who have had the greatest influence on our lives may have absolutely no idea. And someone someday may be telling a story about you, about something that you said, about something that you did, a moment that you showed up for them, and you may not even remember it. Let me give you an example of what I mean. I work with a principal named David. David's a good guy. I never felt like I mentored David. But a few years ago, David and I were having what to me was just a normal conversation. Nothing formal. It was not a mentoring session or it wasn't a coaching session. I was just having conversation. I wasn't trying to give him some profound leadership lesson. And somewhere in that conversation, I shared something that I'd learned over the years. I told him, I said, David, not every emergency for someone else is an emergency for you. Life moved on. Honestly, I didn't even remember saying that. Almost 3 years later, David brought that conversation back up to me. And he didn't just remember the phrase, he remembered exactly where we were when I said it. He remembered the conversation. He remembered that line. And almost 3 years later, he talked about it like it had happened yesterday. And I'm sitting here thinking, I don't even remember telling you this. And that's when this idea really kind of hit me. Leadership is often remembered in moments that the leader has long forgotten. What I thought was an ordinary conversation had become something that he carried with him. And that's why I'm telling you this. You may be sitting here thinking, I'm in my first year in my role. What leadership story do I have to share? But you may be in your first year in adult education. You may be in the first year of your role, but you're not the first year of your life. You have experiences. You've succeeded at things. You've certainly failed at things, and you've learned lessons along the way. Someone around you may need something that you've already learned, and you may share it in what feels like a completely ordinary conversation. You may walk away and forget all about it, but that person may remember exactly where they were when you said it. That's the ripple. So don't underestimate your story. Don't underestimate the conversations you're already having. And don't underestimate what somebody might carry with them because you chose to share something that you had learned. And the good news is creating those kind of ripples don't require some profound speech or some huge leadership moment. Most of the time, it just starts with the small things that we do consistently. So earlier, we talked about stacked leadership habits. And here's what that can actually look like. Maybe you start a meeting with what's one week win this week? What's something positive you can share? Maybe it's sending a positive note to someone on something that you observed, not just a great job, but something very specific. Maybe it's following up after a difficult conversation instead of assuming that everything is fine. Maybe you ask the question that nobody else has asked. None of those things are dramatic, but that's kind of the point. Leadership is usually less about the big moment and more about what you repeatedly choose to do in the small ones. And when those small choices become habits, they shape your influence, they shape your relationships, and eventually they shape the culture around you. All right, now it's your turn. So we've talked about listening, we've talked about engaging, we've talked about advocating, and we've talked about demonstrating integrity. We've talked about credibility, we've talked about relationships, and we've talked about initiative. We've talked about some barriers that sometimes keep us from stepping forward. But none of that matters if it stays right here on these slides. So I want you to think about one question. What is one way that you can lead from your seat this week? Not someday, not when you have more experience, not when someone gives you a different title. This week, maybe it's a conversation you need to have. Maybe it's following up with a student. Maybe it's sharing an idea that you've been sitting on. Maybe it's encouraging a colleague. Maybe it's asking a better question. But think of one thing and drop that in the chat. I love it. Shayna said, I don't have to know everything to lead. Jesselyn, sharing a few new ideas with your supervisor. Great way to step up and demonstrate leadership. Look through some of those responses. Those are real practical. Those are things that we can implement tomorrow or later this week. Oh, Terry, I love it. Ask them how they would do something. Being curious and asking questions. Absolutely. So that's what I want to leave you with this today is that leadership doesn't have to start with something big. It just has to start. So before we finish and wrap up here shortly, I want to bring it all back. We started off today with four things that I wanted to leave you with. The first thing I gave you was the framework, lead. Remember, that's to listen actively, to engage in solutions, to advocate for others, and to demonstrate integrity. Then we talked about the influence formula, that credibility plus relationships plus initiative equals leadership. We talked about some strategies for moving through those barriers that tell us it's not my place, I don't have time, I don't have authority, and what if I mess up? And then finally, you just identified one thing that you can try this next week. And really, that's the whole message. You don't have to do all of this tomorrow. Just start using the influence that you already have a little more intentionally, and then keep growing. Speaking of keep growing, one of the best things that you can do in your first year is intentionally put yourself around ideas and people that help you grow. You've done that today by joining this summit. Maybe read some great books. I noticed someone dropped in the chat earlier, Simon Sinek. He's a great author around leadership and personal development. I've included a couple books here on the slide that have influenced my thinking in the last several months. I've been reading The Leadership Challenge. I'm also about halfway through Grit by Angela Duckworth. Maybe you are a podcast person, so find maybe a podcast or a leadership resource that challenges your thinking. Pop it in on your drive to work. But I think probably the most important thing is connect. Find people in adult education that you can learn from. That's both inside your program and beyond it. That's one of the great things about being part of something like this summit and being a part of COABE. There are people all over this country doing the same work, facing many of the same challenges that you're facing, and they're learning lessons that you can learn from. So you don't have to figure everything out by yourself. Find people who are just a few steps ahead of you and ask questions, share ideas. And as you grow, I challenge you to become that person for somebody else. So I'm going to leave you with one final thought. We've talked a lot today about influence, and we've talked about the ripple effect. The reality is when this webinar ends, most of us will probably never be in the same room again together. But every one of us is going back to a place where we have influence. It's our students, our coworkers, our programs, our families, even our communities. And you may never know the full impact of the way you choose to show up there. Every conversation creates a ripple. Every encouragement creates a ripple. Every act of integrity creates a ripple. And every day you choose how far your ripple will travel. You don't need a title. You don't need permission. And you don't have to wait until you're no longer the new person. You can lead from any seat that you're sitting in now. And I hope that you will. I want to thank you for taking a few moments of your time today to share with me and to be connected. I want to thank the great people at COABE for investing in people doing this work. I want to thank our friends at Essential Education for helping make today's First Year Advantage event possible. And those of you that are joining us here as participants, thank you for choosing adult education. Thank you for the work that you're doing, and thank you for serving the students you serve. My contact information is on the slide, and I really do mean this. Connect with people, build your network, learn from one another. And if there's ever a way that I can be a resource for you, please reach out. And I think we've reached the end of our time today. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you have a great afternoon.